The man you've been hearing about for years, the man responsible for 9/11s, was still out there, and the world was waiting for justice. But here's the thing. For years, we, the FBI, had nothing concrete. No hard evidence. No direct link. Just fragments. But that's when we started working with the CIA, and everything changed. We were now chasing a ghost, and every step brought us closer to the truth. But the question was, could we catch him before it was too late? This isn't just another story about terrorism. This is the story of a global manhunt that spanned years and ended with the world holding its breath. What if I told you that this operation didn't just change the course of history? It changed how we view justice, fear, and the power of persistence. Welcome to the true crime story of how the FBI, along with the CIA, hunted down one of the most notorious criminals in history, Osama bin Laden. Before we dive into this incredible tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel. This story is full of twists and turns that you don't want to miss, and if you subscribe now, you'll never miss another riveting case like this one. The FBI and the CIA, the ultimate secret agents, putting everything on the line for justice. Isn't that a story worth following? You're not just watching a video, you're witnessing history. And trust me, this is just the beginning. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the full story from the first clue to the final confrontation. You see, this wasn't just about finding Osama bin Laden. This was about everything we knew as agents, our tactics, our intelligence, and ultimately our humanity. In 1996, Osama bin Laden first appeared on our radar, but at that point, he wasn't the figure of international terror he became. He was simply a name that didn't quite match the monster we were about to uncover. As I look back on those early days, I remember the uncertainty. Bin Laden had already left his mark, but we had no direct connection to him, no actionable intelligence to pin him down. It was like chasing shadows. We had leads, but we were always left chasing our own tail. The task force that was assigned to bin Laden back then, the most experienced, the most dedicated, knew this would be no easy task, but we had a duty to stop a monster who had a thirst for destruction. The hunt for bin Laden began before the world even knew the true depth of his terror. His rise was gradual. A man building an empire of fear, one attack at a time. But even then, most of the world couldn't understand the level of threat he represented. We knew it, though. We understood that our mission, our goal, would shape the future of this nation. Let me take you back to those early years, when we were still piecing together the puzzle, when the world was oblivious to the looming storm. Every time we came close, it felt like we were 2 steps behind. Each lead we followed, each scrap of information we uncovered, they were just pieces of a much bigger puzzle. And as the years went on, we learned more. We learned how Osama bin Laden worked, how he stayed hidden, and how elusive he had become. But nothing prepared us for the moment we finally had him in our sights. As the years passed, the world became more and more aware of the threat bin Laden posed. But for us, inside the FBI, the pieces of the puzzle were just beginning to fall into place. It wasn't enough to just know who he was. We needed to understand where he was, what he was doing, and how he was operating. This wasn't just about intelligence anymore. It was about finding him before he could strike again. In the beginning, we didn't have much. Just a trail of terrorist activity, intelligence from foreign agencies, and a growing sense of urgency. We knew bin Laden was orchestrating violence from the shadows, but pinpointing his exact location was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. For the FBI, this was not a typical case. This was a fight against time, against a shadow that constantly shifted, making every move feel like a step in the dark. What kept us going was the knowledge that we weren't alone. The CIA had been working on their own intelligence gathering, and it was time for the 2 agencies to merge their forces. I'll never forget the first meeting where we really came together. It wasn't just about intelligence anymore. It was about a collective will to end this. We knew the stakes were high, and the possibility of failure was terrifying. It was in 2001, after the tragic events of September 11th, that everything began to change. The world was in shock, but for us, inside the investigation, we had no time to grieve. Every agent, every analyst, every piece of data we had, none of it was enough. We were chasing ghosts. The only thing that was clear was that we had to find him, and fast. As the FBI and CIA pooled resources, the pressure mounted. We were uncovering new information. But it wasn't enough. We began to suspect that bin Laden was hiding in plain sight. Every lead took us to dead ends, and every person we interrogated seemed to know something without revealing anything useful. The frustration of working with so little was overwhelming. The deeper we dug, the further we felt from the truth. But then, in 2006, something pivotal happened. A breakthrough. We received information that suggested bin Laden was hiding in the mountainous region of Afghanistan, possibly in Pakistan. That intelligence was the first real lead we'd had in years, and it set everything into motion. But the problem was, we still didn't know where to look. Afghanistan was vast, and Pakistan's tribal areas were treacherous and unpredictable. We were back to square one, but now there was hope. We were getting closer, but there was still a long road ahead. For every step we took, bin Laden seemed to take 3 steps back, evading capture with a network of supporters who covered his every move. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse, except the stakes were life and death, and every mouse we thought we cornered vanished into thin air. It wasn't just about the FBI and CIA anymore. We had to work with our international partners, and the pressure from the public and politicians was growing. They wanted answers, and they wanted them fast, but we knew that haste could jeopardize everything. We couldn't afford to rush into anything. If we did, we'd risk blowing the opportunity of a lifetime. As the months turned into years, the frustration was building. We were on the verge of something monumental, but the elusive nature of bin Laden kept us guessing. I remember the long nights we spent sifting through intelligence, the endless meetings, the near misses, and the gut-wrenching feeling that we were always just one step away from cracking the case. Then, in 2010, a new piece of intelligence came to light, a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A possible lead that could finally put an end to this. And so we geared up for what would become the biggest operation in modern history. By 2010, we had been chasing Osama bin Laden for nearly 2 decades. Every lead, every tip, every small piece of intelligence felt like a fleeting hope that would fade away. But then, it happened. A new lead. It wasn't much, but it was the first real lead we had in years, and it came with a sense of urgency. This was the breakthrough we'd all been waiting for. In our line of work, we were used to dead ends. We had been hunting Osama bin Laden for so long that it almost started to feel like we were chasing shadows. But in 2010, that changed. It wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a lifeline. Intelligence suggested that bin Laden could be hiding in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This wasn't just another rumor, it was the kind of lead that made you sit up straight and take notice. The compound was unusual. Located in a relatively quiet city, far from the rugged tribal regions where bin Laden had evaded capture for years, Abbottabad seemed like an odd choice for a man of his notoriety. But that's what made it so compelling. After all these years of dead-end tips, this was something concrete. The house was large, walled off, and had strange security measures. No one could really explain who lived there, or why it was so isolated. This was our moment, our chance to put an end to this manhunt. We didn't have much to go on at first. There was no guarantee it was bin Laden. In fact, we didn't even know if he was there, but we couldn't afford to take any chances. So, we began our investigation. The CIA and FBI quickly began working together to gather more intelligence. Every resource, every asset we had, was put to use. We monitored the compound from every angle. We tapped into communications, and we began speaking to people in the area. Each piece of information we gathered led us closer, but still, we couldn't say for certain that Osama bin Laden was there. For a few months, it felt like we were running in circles. Every angle we pursued seemed to hit a wall. We were cautious. This compound could just be a mirage. It could be a different high-value target, or it could be nothing at all. But then came the confirmation. Everything started to line up. The first real clue came from satellite images. The compound had been built with high walls, and there was no internet connection or phone line to the outside world. People who lived nearby said that they rarely saw anyone leave the house. The people who lived there kept to themselves, which made it all the more suspicious. But there was more. A man who had recently lived there had ties to terrorism, and there were even more reports suggesting that bin Laden might be using this place to hide in plain sight. But we had to be sure. We couldn't rush in without solid evidence. Not after all these years. We needed more intelligence. The pressure was mounting. This could be our one shot at capturing one of the world's most wanted men. So, we launched surveillance operations. The CIA tapped into local sources and began gathering more intelligence from people in the region. Every piece of the puzzle that we gathered pushed us closer to the truth. And finally, we had it. The evidence pointed to bin Laden being in the compound. It was enough to convince the highest authorities that this was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. At that point, the plan was set in motion. We had the lead we needed, and now the task was clear. We would have to act quickly, cautiously, and decisively. We had no room for error. Bin Laden's capture was no longer a dream. It was within our reach. As the operation began to take shape, the CIA, the FBI, and the military worked hand in hand, preparing for what would be one of the most high-stakes missions in history. The world was about to change, but we couldn't afford to rush. Every detail had to be perfected. We had to get this right. There was no second chance. Once we confirmed the compound in Abbottabad, everything changed. The entire operation shifted from a long-term investigation to an immediate action plan. For years, we'd been reacting, chasing after leads that slipped away like dust through our fingers. But now, for the first time, we were in control. We had a location. And that meant only one thing. It was time to plan the capture of Osama bin Laden. The operation's complexity was staggering. Every detail mattered. Every decision carried the weight of history. Inside the command rooms, tension filled the air. The FBI's role was clear. Provide the intelligence backbone. Every phone call, every movement pattern, every coded message was analyzed with surgical precision. Meanwhile, the CIA monitored the compound day and night. For months, drones hovered silently above Abbottabad, capturing every shadow that moved within those walls. What stood out immediately was how ordinary the compound seemed. And yet, nothing about it was normal. The family living there burned their trash instead of leaving it out for collection. They had no internet, no phone line, and no visitors. Children played inside the high walls, but never went to school. It was a fortress disguised as a home. Every behavior screamed secrecy. Inside our team, debates raged. Was it really him? Could we risk everything based on probability? We'd made mistakes before. Operations gone wrong because we acted too soon or trusted the wrong intel. The pressure from Washington was immense, but our instincts told us to proceed carefully. We couldn't afford to be wrong. This wasn't just a tactical operation. It was a moral one. The death of an innocent family or an error in judgment would be catastrophic. Weeks turned into months. Surveillance intensified. Analysts noted a man who never stepped outside the compound's main walls. Tall, lean, and constantly shielded from view. We started calling him the Pacer. He would walk in circles in the courtyard for hours, hidden beneath a canopy. No one had ever seen his face, but his height, his habits, they matched bin Laden perfectly. The more we watched, the more certain we became. By late 2010, the evidence was overwhelming. The president was briefed. Multiple agencies weighed in: the Pentagon, CIA, FBI, and Joint Special Operations Command. The question was no longer if we would strike, but how. Two options were on the table: a precision airstrike that would obliterate the compound, or a surgical ground operation carried out by Navy SEALs. The first option was cleaner, safer, but it came with a fatal flaw. There would be no body to confirm the kill. The second option was dangerous, but it could bring closure. As the debates continued, I remember staring at the map of Abbottabad and feeling the weight of 20 years of pursuit pressing down on my shoulders. This was it, the culmination of everything we'd worked for since the first attacks. Every face we'd lost, every mission that failed, every moment of frustration and doubt had led to this point. In the end, the choice was made. We would go in. No bombs, no distant strike. A team of elite operators would breach the compound, face whatever was inside, and bring bin Laden back, dead or alive. And so the gears of history began to turn. The night was chosen. The plan was sealed. All that was left was the execution. The night was set. The decision had been made. It was time for SEAL Team 6 to act. After months of planning, we knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just a mission to capture a terrorist. This was a mission to bring justice, to put an end to the threat Osama bin Laden had posed for almost 2 decades. Every step we had taken had led to this one night. Now we had to make it count. The day before the operation was a blur. Inside the command rooms, the energy was a mix of anticipation and fear. Every agency involved was in sync. The military, intelligence agencies, and the FBI had worked together for months to ensure every angle was covered. But we all knew this would be the hardest part. The mission was no longer hypothetical. It was real. The stakes were higher than ever. I remember the countdown ticking away. SEAL Team 6 was already on the ground, ready to deploy. They were the best of the best. These men had faced some of the most dangerous situations in the world. But this operation was different. The mission wasn't just about capturing a man, it was about ending a global threat. The world was watching, but for us on the inside, all that mattered was success. As night fell on Abbottabad, our team's role was coming to fruition. Our surveillance, our intelligence, everything was in place. SEAL Team 6 began their descent into the darkness. Their Black Hawk helicopters moved silently, invisible to the naked eye. The world around them was still, but inside the helicopters, the tension was palpable. The men aboard knew this wasn't just another night. This could be the night they ended one of the most infamous terror networks the world had ever seen. The mission was timed to perfection. The intel we had gathered gave us confidence, but nothing was certain. The moment those helicopters landed in the compound's backyard, it was chaos. SEAL Team 6 began their breach with military precision, entering the compound from every angle. Inside, the terrorists guarding the compound had no idea what was coming. As the team swept through the compound, I remember sitting in the command center, watching the live feed from the operation. I could see the tactical team moving through the rooms. I could see the doors being broken down. I could see them encountering resistance. The men of SEAL Team 6 were focused. Nothing would deter them from their mission. Minutes passed like hours. We had eyes on the mission, but we still weren't sure. Every door the team opened, every room they cleared, brought us closer to the man we had been hunting for so long. The tension in that room was suffocating. The mission was nearing its climax, and no one could breathe easy until we had answers. And then, we got it. The message came through: target located. Osama bin Laden is dead. In that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But there was no celebration, no victory. Cheers, there was only relief. We had done it. We had found the man responsible for 9/11s, for countless deaths, and we had brought him to justice. But even as I sat there processing what had just happened, I knew it wasn't over. There was still work to do. The mission wasn't just about killing bin Laden, it was about securing the compound, gathering evidence, and making sure there was no trace of the terror network left behind. As SEAL Team 6 moved to secure the compound, we were already planning the next steps. The intelligence we had gathered would be invaluable. But in that moment, All we could do was take a breath and know that for once the world was a little bit safer. Osama bin Laden was dead. But the mission didn't stop there. It was just the beginning of a much larger story. The world watched as the news broke. Osama bin Laden was dead. After nearly 2 decades of searching, hunting, and chasing false leads, it was finally over. But for those of us who had been involved in the operation, the sense of relief was immediate, yet complicated. It wasn't just about the end of a manhunt. It was about what that moment represented. It was the culmination of years of work, of sacrifice, and of a deep, shared commitment to justice. The days following the operation were a whirlwind. While the world outside celebrated the death of one of the most infamous terrorists in history, those of us involved in the mission knew that our work wasn't done. We had successfully neutralized bin Laden. But there were still questions to answer and consequences to face. The immediate relief we felt was quickly replaced with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. I remember the weight of the moment when the news spread across the globe. It wasn't just a personal victory. This was a victory for the families who lost loved ones in the 9/11 attacks, for the military personnel who fought and died in the years that followed, and for all those affected by terrorism worldwide. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. While we had captured bin Laden, we now had to contend with the larger implications. His death sent a shockwave through terrorist organizations around the world, and we knew it would have a ripple effect on the global fight against terror. The intelligence we had gathered during the operation was invaluable, but it was also clear that the death of bin Laden wouldn't immediately dismantle the network he had built. We needed to understand what came next. The immediate aftermath of the raid was critical. We had to secure the compound in Abbottabad, collect evidence, and begin the process of debriefing the team. As the FBI, we worked closely with other agencies to ensure that all intelligence was retrieved and analyzed. The photographs of bin Laden's body were sent to intelligence officials, but there was no public reveal of his remains. The world would not see what we had seen. The body was buried at sea, a decision that generated its own controversy, but it was a necessary one, as we could not risk creating a martyr out of him. For many of us who had been part of this investigation from the beginning, the emotions were mixed. Yes, there was a sense of accomplishment, but the loss and sacrifice that had been endured to reach this point were not forgotten. Families had lost their loved ones in the attacks, and it was their memory that had fueled the drive to capture bin Laden. There were many days in those first years after 9/11 when it felt like the world had shifted irrevocably, and for the agents involved, this was a significant piece of the puzzle finally falling into place. But even with bin Laden's death, the work didn't stop. The fight against terror continued, and the intelligence we gathered from the compound would go on to reveal connections and networks that had previously remained hidden. The death of bin Laden didn't eliminate the threat of terrorism. It shifted, and the agencies involved, the FBI, CIA, and the military, had to continue adapting to a rapidly changing world. In those first weeks, while the celebrations continued in the media, we couldn't help but think about the future. The implications of this mission were far-reaching, and we had to stay vigilant. Bin Laden's death was a monumental achievement, but the war on terror was far from over. It was a reminder that justice, while it had been served in this case, was a long-term pursuit that required constant attention. As we processed the aftermath, it was clear that this operation would be studied for years to come. It was a watershed moment in the fight against terror. But for us, it was just another chapter in an ongoing journey. Osama bin Laden's death had brought closure to a dark chapter in history. But there would always be more work to do. The death of Osama bin Laden was supposed to be the end. For years, the world had waited for this moment. His death marked the conclusion of a mission that had spanned 2 decades. But for those of us in the intelligence and law enforcement community, it was just another step in a much longer war. The world may have felt like it could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The mastermind behind 9/11 was gone. And with his death, it seemed like the clouds of terror might finally part. But the truth was much more complicated. Bin Laden's death didn't end terrorism. It didn't erase the network he had built. It didn't take away the global threat posed by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. It only shifted the playing field. For us inside the FBI, CIA, and military, the real work began after bin Laden's death. We knew that his passing would create a power vacuum within the terrorist world. Al-Qaeda had been shattered by his death, but there were still remnants of the organization that would continue to operate and adapt. New leaders would rise to fill the gap. This was not the time to celebrate or rest. It was time to double down, to look for the next threat, and to understand what intelligence we had gained from the operation. One of the most immediate concerns was the impact bin Laden's death would have on his followers. We had seen terrorist organizations rally around martyrs before, and bin Laden's death would surely have the same effect. His followers, both within Al-Qaeda and in other extremist groups, would use his death to fuel their propaganda machine, turning him into a martyr. The narrative would shift from the defeat of a terrorist leader to the creation of a symbol, one that would inspire future attacks. Another concern was the rise of other extremist groups. While Al-Qaeda had been the primary focus of our efforts for years, its affiliates had been gaining ground. Groups like ISIS had grown in influence, and bin Laden's death did little to deter their ambitions. If anything, it fueled their desire to prove that they could carry on his legacy. New terror networks would emerge, and our focus would have to shift to stopping them before they could become as powerful as Al-Qaeda had once been. From an operational standpoint, the intelligence we had collected from bin Laden's compound was invaluable. It gave us insight into Al-Qaeda's operations, communications, and plans for future attacks. But what we didn't anticipate was just how difficult it would be to sift through the mountains of information we had recovered. There were laptops, hard drives, and documents, all filled with information that needed to be analyzed. This was no ordinary intelligence haul. This was the motherlode. It would take months, even years, to process all of it. The CIA and FBI worked around the clock, piecing together every piece of intelligence. We discovered that bin Laden's network was far more extensive than we had originally thought. The reach of Al-Qaeda extended across continents, from the Middle East to Africa to Southeast Asia. While bin Laden was the figurehead, the organization was much larger and more complex than we had imagined. The mission to dismantle it would take more than just one successful operation. It would take an ongoing, relentless effort. The repercussions of his death also rippled through the intelligence community. Every operation, every decision, every lead became even more critical. The loss of bin Laden meant we had to reassess every strategy, every tactic. The tactics we had used to hunt him down could no longer be relied upon. We had to adapt, evolve, and anticipate what would come next. In the months that followed, there were attacks that could be traced back to the power vacuum bin Laden's death had left behind. His followers were out for revenge. They were angry, frustrated, and desperate to keep the fight going. In the immediate aftermath, there were concerns about increased attacks on American soil, retaliation for bin Laden's death. As we moved forward, there was one thing that was certain: the death of Osama bin Laden had not ended the war on terror. It had merely changed its shape. And for those of us who had dedicated our careers to fighting terrorism, the fight was far from over. The mission to eliminate bin Laden had been a success, but the global security challenges we faced were more complex than ever. We had disrupted Al-Qaeda, but we had not destroyed it. There would be new leaders, new tactics, and new threats. The war was not over, and we could never afford to lose sight of that. The death of Osama bin Laden had brought us a step closer to victory, but the battle was ongoing. When we secured the compound in Abbottabad, it was like stepping into the mind of one of the most dangerous men in history. It wasn't just a house. It was a treasure trove of intelligence. the kind we had been desperately hunting for over a decade. But as we sifted through the materials, the reality set in. This wasn't the closure we had hoped for. This was a new beginning. After the SEAL Team 6 had completed the mission and secured Osama bin Laden's compound, the focus shifted. Bin Laden may have been dead, but his legacy, his terror network, and the wealth of information he left behind was still very much alive. The task before us was monumental: to comb through a vast collection of intelligence that could hold the keys to dismantling the terror organization he built. Inside the compound, we discovered more than we could have imagined. Computers, hard drives, documents, and personal correspondence filled the rooms. It was overwhelming. The sheer volume of material was staggering, but even more astonishing was what we found within those materials. This wasn't just the typical, scattered intelligence we had come to expect from a target. This was bin Laden's personal archive, a record of his communications, plans, and his strategic thoughts over the years. The moment we started going through the documents and digital files, it became clear bin Laden had been working relentlessly to expand his global influence, even in his final years. While many assumed that Al-Qaeda had lost its grip on the world stage, the materials we uncovered showed the opposite. Bin Laden had been in contact with extremist groups all over the world, coordinating attacks, providing funding, and strategizing new tactics. His network was still very much alive and operational. There were documents that outlined plans for future attacks. Bin Laden had a clear vision of where he wanted to take Al-Qaeda next. He wasn't just reacting to events, he was planning years ahead, setting the stage for the next wave of terror. His fixation on the West, especially the United States, remained a central theme throughout. But what was more disturbing was how well organized and calculated his plans had become. He had an extensive network of operatives, many of whom we had no previous knowledge of. The intelligence that came from his compound revealed the scope and reach of Al-Qaeda's activities. While we were discovering this, there was also the disturbing reality that we hadn't uncovered everything. The intelligence we had gathered was still just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper we dug, the more we realized that bin Laden's network had evolved, adapted, and diversified over the years. There were foreign cells, sleeper agents, and sympathizers scattered across the globe. The threat wasn't just coming from one source, it was decentralized. The documents and data we found pointed to a more dangerous future, a future where bin Laden's death might create a more fractured but still potent terror network. What really stood out was bin Laden's connection to other global terrorist organizations. He wasn't just focused on Al-Qaeda, he was trying to create a broader coalition of extremist groups. There were records of alliances, financial support, and strategic planning with groups that we hadn't yet fully identified. His influence was widespread, and his ability to inspire and unite different factions was perhaps his most dangerous weapon. We knew that in order to truly end the threat, we would need to act fast. We couldn't afford to let this intelligence sit idle. Every document, every file, and every piece of data had to be analyzed, decrypted, and acted upon. The task was Herculean, but it was one we knew had to be done if we were to prevent the next attack. But the challenge didn't end with the intelligence we uncovered. There were ethical and political considerations to contend with as well. Bin Laden's death and the subsequent information retrieval had far-reaching implications. Countries were now questioning the methods used to capture him. There were debates about the morality of killing him without a trial. The body was buried at sea to avoid creating a martyr, but that decision, too, sparked controversy. For us in the intelligence and law enforcement community, the most significant takeaway was the realization that the war on terror had fundamentally changed. The world was no longer dealing with a single mastermind. We were now facing a network that operated in the shadows, beyond traditional borders, and with the ability to adapt in real time. It wasn't just about hunting down one leader, it was about dismantling an entire ideology and a network that had grown far beyond its origins. As the weeks passed, we continued to sift through the data, and what we uncovered changed everything. The intelligence gleaned from bin Laden's compound would help shape future operations, but it also reinforced the complexity and scale of the task at hand. The war against terrorism was no longer just about removing a leader from power, it was about cutting off the network at its core and neutralizing threats before they could materialize. The mission to capture Osama bin Laden had succeeded, but the intelligence war that followed would prove to be just as critical, if not more so. Osama bin Laden's death marked a significant chapter in the global fight against terrorism. But as we celebrated the mission's success, a deeper realization began to sink in. The war on terror wasn't over. If anything, it had just evolved. When Osama bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad, it felt like the culmination of a long and painful chapter in the history of terrorism. For the United States, for the intelligence community, and for the families affected by 9/11, his death was a victory, a long-awaited moment of justice. But for those of us in law enforcement and intelligence, it wasn't the end. It was a significant milestone, but it also opened up a new set of challenges and complexities. The immediate reaction to bin Laden's death was one of relief. It was as though a weight had been lifted off the shoulders of the world, but as the days and weeks passed, we began to realize the long-term implications of his death on global security. The immediate threat posed by bin Laden was neutralized, but the network he built and the ideology he propagated was far from gone. One of the most profound realizations was that bin Laden's death didn't mark the end of Al-Qaeda or the end of the fight against terrorism. It simply marked a shift. While his death disrupted Al-Qaeda's central command, it didn't destroy the decentralized structure of the global jihadist movement. New leaders began to emerge, and other groups, such as ISIS, grew in influence. Terrorism had become a more fractured, yet still dangerous, global phenomenon. The death of bin Laden exposed an important truth: the nature of terrorism had changed. It was no longer about one man controlling a centralized organization. The rise of networks and affiliates, each with their own goals and motivations, meant that we were facing a far more complex and diverse threat. The intelligence we gathered from bin Laden's compound provided crucial insights, but it also showed that dismantling this new threat would require a different approach. In the years following bin Laden's death, we saw the growth of new terror groups, many of them inspired by the same ideology bin Laden championed. But they operated with a level of autonomy that was previously unimaginable. They were harder to track, harder to infiltrate, and more willing to strike in unexpected ways. These groups were no longer solely focused on grand-scale attacks like 9/11. They adopted new tactics, such as lone wolf attacks, and spread their message across social media, recruiting disaffected individuals from all corners of the world. The mission that killed bin Laden also raised a number of strategic questions within the intelligence community. The operation was a success, but it demonstrated the challenges of dealing with a fragmented enemy. The old methods of tracking and neutralizing terrorist leaders had worked in the past, but with the rise of decentralized terror cells, we needed to rethink our approach. The intelligence we gained from the compound became a critical tool in understanding the evolution of terrorism, but it also highlighted how much more there was to do. One key lesson we learned from the operation was the importance of international collaboration. The CIA, FBI, and military had worked together on this mission, but the fight against terrorism would require even closer cooperation between nations. Terrorism didn't have borders, and neither could the efforts to stop it. Our shared intelligence, joint operations, and coordinated actions were crucial in neutralizing the threat. But perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all was that bin Laden's death did not eliminate the ideology that fueled his actions. His death was a symbolic victory, but the roots of extremism that he helped plant continued to grow in the shadows. As the world moved on, the ideology continued to inspire new generations of recruits, many of whom didn't need a centralized organization to carry out their attacks. As we reflected on bin Laden's death, it became clear that the fight against terrorism would be a long, ongoing battle. His death might have been a significant victory, but the war was far from over. It would require constant vigilance, collaboration, and adaptation to deal with the new, more complex world of terrorism that had emerged. And it would require more than just military might. The true battle lay in the fight against the ideology, in disrupting the networks, and in keeping communities safe from the spread of radicalization. In the years since, the intelligence community has continued to evolve, as have the methods used by terrorists. But the legacy